But by the end of the 80s, Thames were in trouble. The whole of ITV was in trouble, in fact, for supposed left-wing broadcasting tendencies. For left-wing tendencies, of course, read occasionally questioning the actions of the British government. The BBC had already suffered this, but of course Thatcher was much more outraged at the BBC because it was a public service broadcaster, essentially a nationalised industry, working for the people, funded by the people, which is obviously bad enough on its own, before you consider the outrage of the corporation occasionally giving voice to people who think that Thatcher might have been some kind of gigantic evil succubus who was destroying Britain from the inside. Look, I can't help it, alright? I am a Bevanite socialist, I am a red. Up the workers, part of the union, all of that. It's how I am. Can't keep it out. Maybe someday the chairman of the Conservative Party will commission a right-wing version of this programme. Anyway, having won an unprecedented third term, Thatcher was well into her drunk with power, Pinochet address phase, and rapidly losing her mind, when 3 IRA members were shot dead by the SAS in Gibraltar, in what many saw as a more exotic mini-version of Bloody Sunday. This was the culmination of Operation Flavius. Danny McCann, Sean Savage and Myred Farrell were planning to detonate a car bomb during the changing of the guard. Operation Flavius was an SAS mission specifically targeted against them. All fair enough, but it was meant to be an arrest mission. Instead, it ended with the IRA members dead. The official story went roughly as follows. There was a gigantic car bomb that they were working on at the time. The SAS leapt in, defused the bomb. There was a battle. The SAS won 3-0. The British press practically danced in the streets. Less credulous members of the public couldn't help but mutter "chinny reckon" under their breath. There were strong suspicions that the gigantic car bomb was a lie, the gun battle was a lie, and that the SAS members had just shot them for expediency's sake. A few weeks later, ITV broadcast a documentary about the shootings as part of the This Week strand. The documentary was called Death on the Rock, and it was made by Thames Television. In it, Julian Mannion conducted an investigation that strongly suggested that the members were unarmed, the shootings were unprovoked, and the story about the car bomb and the gunfight was a gigantic lie, cooked up by the government to make it seem more like a successful military operation, and less like exactly the same sort of cold-blooded murder that the IRA had been planning in the first place. Mrs. Thatcher wasn't impressed. After an unsuccessful attempt to get the documentary shelved altogether, she described it as trial by television, saying in an interview in so many words that it represented the death of freedom, with the kind of unmitigated gall only she'd be capable of, to be honest. At that moment, Thames Television hurtled straight to the top of her enemies list. She almost certainly actually had one. Also ranking high on the list was the regulatory body, the IBA, who'd flatly refused to pull the documentary, saying that the issues as we see them relate to free speech and free inquiry, which underpin individual liberty in a democracy. Mrs. Thatcher had to content herself in the short term with the documentary being torn to shreds as treasonous bastardry by her pet newspapers, most notably the Sunday Times and the Sun. I told you he'd be back. But in the long term, plans were drawn up that would make ITV a lot more personable in the future. Now, I can't say that Death on the Rock caused Broadcasting Act 1990 because plans for something similar were in the 1987 manifesto. But it's hard not to at least suspect that the documentary at least played a large part in the final product, the wholesale deregulation of ITV, the replacement of the IBA with the ITC, deliberately invented to be a soft touch. And of course, the death of Margaret Thatcher's sworn enemies that week, Thames Television. In the 1991 franchise round, Thames didn't really expect to lose that franchise. Their bid was sensible enough, if anything it was a bit low, but they thought not unreasonably that they were too big and made too valuable a contribution to the network to be taken out and executed merely on the basis of a cash sum. The ITC had an extraordinary circumstances clause, which Thames were hoping they'd use, if the worst came to the worst. It did, and they didn't. It was one of the biggest TV industry news stories in a very long while. Thames Television, the station that gave us Cannon, Rainbow, Minder, Rumpole of the Bailey, Kenny Everett Video Show, The Quatermass Conclusion, Sweeney, Van der Valk, The World at War. The ITV station, in many ways, in such a minds of ITV, was on death row. And how did they take it? Well, their immediate reaction was to scrap the ITV generic ident in favour of something they'd been using for regional programming since late 1990. The second great Thames ident. For my money, at least the equal of the Skyline. And if Thames had continued into the 90s with this at the helm, it might be recognised as such today. Bold, brassy and even defiant, the only touch of melancholy in it is imposed from outside as a result of knowing that this was the last Thames ident. Without knowing that, there's no hint that this is the symbol of a company awaiting the gallows. In contrast, LWT didn't have too much trouble getting through the crapshoot that was the 1991 franchise ran, easily winning the franchise back with a bid of £7.5 million. Although their nearest rivals did actually bid higher than them, but that was their downfall. They bid £36 million, and this is an annual payment, remember. Unless that consortium was headed by the Sultan of Brunei, that was never going to happen. And so LWT were more or less unopposed and left to gawp in shock from the sidelines as their big brother and bitter rival bit the dust. Thames and LWT had never really got on, ever since LWT's early days of highbrow programming and negligible ratings, to which Thames, in a display of dirty pull, responded by discounting their advertising airtime, encouraging people to invest in them instead of LWT. The fallout from that little bit of prickmanship was that Thames and LWT never promoted each other's programmes, or only very rarely. But in 1991 this civil war was abruptly ended. LWT won. On the 31st of December 1992, after a quarter of a century, Thames broadcast their last programme, a clip show, called the End of the Year Show. It was, of course, shown throughout the country, apart from in places like the South, whose channels were also ending. Then there was a brief, in-vision message from the station head, Richard Dunn, which portrayed not an iota of bitterness, even though they had 5 times as much to be bitter about as Southern, who of course ended with a 2.5-hour paddy. And then finally, the full version of a montage, which had been appearing in drips and drabs throughout that Christmas season, to the tune of the tourists' version of I Only Want to Be With You, because they really did. There was always hope. We didn't know much about these new guys. Maybe, just maybe, they would honour Thames's legacy. Maybe this new station could be as worthwhile as the last.
Thames, a talent for television.
Now, a few seconds from midnight, let's go over to Westminster for the chimes of Big Ben.